we've got lives and I've got children, and the effort that we put in, because we work really hard.
It was one of the few times Ringo ever admitted the truth. He didn't hate Paul McCartney in the public sense, but deep inside, he still carried the scars of betrayal, of being dismissed, belittled, and left behind. The world remembered them as legends, brothers in music. But behind the curtain, one Beatle had quietly built a wall around his heart, protecting himself from the pain of a friendship that fame had forever changed. As the decades passed, time did what fame and fortune could not. It softened the edges of old wounds. The bitterness that had once defined Ringo Starr's relationship with Paul McCartney slowly began to fade, replaced by something gentler, quieter, understanding. By the 1990s, both men had lived lifetimes apart. They had seen the rise and fall of fame, faced personal losses, and weathered the storms of addiction, loneliness, and grief. John Lennon's shocking murder in 1980 had been a wake-up call for them all. It reminded Ringo and Paul that no matter how deep the anger once ran, the bond between them was far greater than the things that tore them apart. Ringo was one of the first to arrive in New York after John's death. He flew across the Atlantic to comfort Yoko Ono and Sean, John's young son. The loss hit him like a wave, not only because John was gone, but because it forced Ringo to face the fragility of life and how easily time could slip away while people stayed angry over old battles. That tragedy was the beginning of a quiet healing between Ringo and Paul. In the years that followed, they slowly began to reconnect, not as former bandmates, but as two aging men who had been through the same storm and somehow survived. When they reunited for the anthology project in the mid-1990s, sitting in the studio together after decades apart, something remarkable happened. The tension was gone. The pride, the resentment, the competition, all of it had faded. What remained were memories, laughter, and music. Paul strummed his guitar, Ringo tapped out a beat, and for a brief moment, it felt like 1963 again. Four friends in a room, chasing the sound that had changed the world. Only this time, there were just two of them left to carry the torch. Ringo later said, "When we played again, it wasn't about money or fame. It was about friendship, about remembering who we were before everything got complicated." As the years rolled on, they appeared together more often, at concerts, award shows, and tributes. The world saw two old Beatles smiling, laughing, and embracing like brothers. But what most people didn't know was that behind those smiles was decades of unspoken pain. Finally, laid to rest, Ringo once reflected in an interview, "We went through too much together. There were moments I hated him, and I'm sure he hated me. But hate doesn't last forever. Love does." That simple statement summed up everything. After all the fame, fortune, and heartbreak, love was all that remained. The same love that began in a small club in Liverpool so many years ago. Today, Ringo Starr and Paul McCartney are two of the last living links to a musical revolution that defined a generation. They've lost friends, battled personal demons, and watched the world change beyond recognition. Yet, when they share the stage, as they have in recent years, something magical still happens. When Paul performs Hey Jude and calls out, "Ringo's in the house," the crowd erupts, not just for nostalgia, but for the story. The journey of two men who went from brothers to rivals, and finally, to brothers again. In one touching moment, during a charity concert, Paul turned to Ringo and said, "I love you, man," without missing a beat. Ringo grinned and replied, "I love you too, man." It was simple, genuine, and real. The kind of moment that spoke louder than any song they ever wrote. And yet, behind that warmth, there's still a quiet sadness in Ringo's eyes whenever he talks about the past. He knows how lucky he was to be part of something so extraordinary. but he also knows what it cost. At 84, Ringo often speaks of peace, love, and forgiveness. Those aren't just words for him. They're the lessons he learned the hard way. He once said, "You can't live your life angry. You can't carry hate forever. Because when the people you love are gone, all you're left with is regret." So, yes, Ringo Starr once truly hated Paul McCartney, or at least he thought he did. But time, as it always does, revealed the truth. What he felt wasn't hatred. It was hurt, the deep kind that only comes when you love someone like family. And in the end, that's what they were. Not just bandmates, not just Beatles, but brothers, bound by music, memories, and the kind of love that even fame couldn't destroy. As the years slipped by, Ringo Starr and Paul McCartney's story evolved into something few could have predicted. A quiet redemption arc written by time itself. The world had watched their rise, their fall, and their long silence. But as old age softened the sharp edges of ego and pride, something beautiful emerged: forgiveness. By the 2000s, both men had lived through unimaginable change. They had lost John Lennon and George Harrison, endured public scrutiny for decades, and seen their music transform into legend. But fame no longer mattered. What mattered now was connection, the kind that fame had once threatened to destroy. In 2009, when Paul and Ringo shared the stage together at the David Lynch Foundation concert in New York, it felt like history completing a circle. The sight of the two surviving Beatles performing side by side brought audiences to tears. They laughed, hugged, and even teased each other like brothers. The tension that once defined them was gone, replaced by mutual respect and a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had endured. Ringo later said in an interview, "It's just great when we play together. It feels like coming home." That one sentence carried the weight of 50 years. The heartbreak, the rivalry, and the healing. And when Paul inducted Ringo into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2015, the emotion was undeniable. Standing before the crowd, Paul smiled and said, "Ringo was and always will be one of the best drummers in the world, and one of the best friends I've ever had." The audience erupted in applause, but it was Ringo's quiet grin that said everything. After decades of distance, the love between them had found its way back. For Ringo, that forgiveness didn't come easily. He had spent years trying to bury the anger, the feeling of being overshadowed, dismissed, or left behind. But in his later years, he began to realize that the only thing more painful than being hurt was holding on to that hurt forever. In his autobiography and later interviews, he spoke openly about that evolution. "We were kids when it all happened. We didn't know what we were doing half the time. Fame just threw us into a storm, and we all reacted differently. But deep down, I always loved them. I still do, and it shows." In recent years, Paul and Ringo's reunions have carried an unmistakable warmth. Whether it's a small jam session or a charity concert, their chemistry remains unbroken. They still finish each other's sentences, still share the same quiet humor, and still feel that invisible bond that only brothers in music can understand. But when Ringo talks about the Beatles today, there's always a shadow behind the smile. He's grateful, yes, but he's also haunted by what was lost. The laughter, the late nights, the endless energy of youth, all gone, leaving behind memories too powerful to fade. "I still dream of those days," he once admitted. "Sometimes I wake up and think we're still in the studio." The tragedy of Ringo Starr isn't about fame, fortune, or even the pain of betrayal. It's about the weight of memory, the burden of carrying the world's most beloved band in his heart long after the music stopped. At 84, Ringo still tours, still preaches peace and love, and still flashes that famous grin that once charmed millions. But behind that grin lies a man who's seen it all: the heights of stardom, the darkness of addiction, the ache of loss, and the quiet grace of forgiveness. When asked recently if he misses the Beatles, Ringo didn't hesitate. "Every day," he said softly, "but I'm just grateful for the love we had. We were four boys who made some noise, and the world listened. That's enough for me. And perhaps that's the real story, not of hatred, but of healing. Not of rivalry, but of reunion. Because the truth is, Ringo Starr never truly hated Paul McCartney. He hated what fame did to them, how it twisted friendship into competition and love into silence. But in the end, love won. It always does. So when Paul and Ringo walk on stage together today, smiling like two old friends who've seen both heaven and hell, they remind the world of something timeless, that no matter how far apart people drift, some bonds can never truly be broken. Because even after all the anger, the silence, and the heartbreak, they will always be the Beatles. For decades, Ringo Starr was known as the easygoing Beatle, the calm in the storm, the man who never seemed to let fame or tension get to him. While John Lennon and Paul McCartney clashed over creativity and control, and George Harrison struggled to find his voice between them, Ringo was the steady hand that held the Beatles together. He was the peacekeeper, the one who smiled through the chaos. But what fans didn't know is that even Ringo had a breaking point. Behind that friendly grin and soft-spoken nature, there was one person who pushed Ringo Starr to the edge. One man he truly couldn't stand. Through the band's explosive fame, ego clashes, and painful breakup, Ringo managed to forgive almost everyone. Except him. It wasn't about money or music. It was about trust, betrayal, and the feeling of being treated like he didn't matter. Over the years, Ringo stayed silent about his resentment, choosing diplomacy over drama. But those closest to him knew the truth. Behind closed doors, Ringo carried bitterness that lasted decades. This wasn't the story of the happy drummer everyone adored. It was the story of the only time Ringo Starr's patience ran out. Because even the most peaceful Beatle had his limits. And when those limits were crossed, Ringo didn't forget. So who was the man Ringo Starr truly hated? What happened behind the scenes that broke one of rock's most famous friendships? The truth is darker, more personal, and more painful than fans ever imagined. Before he became one of the most famous drummers in history, Ringo Starr was just Richard Starkey, a poor kid from Liverpool who grew up with nothing but a dream. His childhood was far from easy. Constantly sick and in and out of hospitals, Ringo spent years bedridden, staring out hospital windows while other kids played outside. But through the pain, he found rhythm, tapping on pots, pans, and tabletops, finding music in the smallest sounds. By his late teens, he had transformed that rhythm into a calling. He joined local skiffle and rock bands, slowly earning a reputation as a dependable, soulful drummer. That reputation would soon change his life forever. In 1962, the Beatles were on the rise, but not yet legends. Their original drummer, Pete Best, had just been fired, and the band needed someone who could keep up with the new energy they were bringing to the stage. When Ringo Starr joined John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison, something clicked. His steady timing, understated confidence, and charm completed the puzzle. Suddenly, the Beatles weren't just another Liverpool band. They were unstoppable. From Please Please Me to A Hard Day's Night, the world fell in love with all four of them. But Ringo had a special kind of appeal. He wasn't the genius songwriter or the mysterious philosopher. He was the everyman. Fans saw him as the Beatle they could actually relate to, always smiling, always patient, always keeping the rhythm while the others argued about lyrics and egos. But behind the scenes, Ringo often felt like the outsider. John and Paul were the creative powerhouses. George was the quiet thinker finding his own musical voice. And Ringo, well, he was the drummer. While fans adored him, the industry didn't always take him seriously. He once said, "I always felt lucky just to be there, but sometimes it felt like they forgot I was part of it too." As fame exploded, so did the tension. By the mid-1960s, the Beatles were living in a pressure cooker of constant touring, interviews, and creative disputes. John and Paul's friendly rivalry over songwriting credits turned into a cold war of egos. George grew frustrated at being overshadowed. And Ringo? He tried to stay out of it, until the fighting started to affect him directly. During the recording of the White Album in 1968, cracks in the band's unity became impossible to hide. John and Paul were barely speaking. George was bitter and withdrawn. The recording sessions were tense, and everyone was walking on eggshells. For Ringo, it became unbearable. He was tired of being treated like a background player in a band that was supposed to be built on brotherhood. The breaking point came when one of his bandmates, the one Ringo had always admired, started openly criticizing his drumming. During one heated session, Ringo tried his best to keep up with the perfectionism surrounding the White Album. But instead of support, he got condescension. "You're not playing it right," came the sharp remark from across the studio. Ringo tried to laugh it off, but deep down, something broke. For years, he had been the easygoing one, the peacemaker who tried to hold everyone together. But now, even he was being made to feel like he didn't belong. That night, Ringo packed his things and walked out of the studio without saying a word. For the first time ever, the Beatles were without their drummer. He flew to Sardinia with his family, exhausted and heartbroken. While the rest of the band panicked and tried to replace him, Ringo sat on a boat, unsure if he would ever return. "I felt like an outsider," he said later. "Like they didn't need me anymore." It was a rare glimpse into the pain behind his calm demeanor, the hidden wounds that came from years of being dismissed by the very people he considered brothers. Of course, the Beatles begged him to come back. When he returned to Abbey Road 2 weeks later, the studio was covered in flowers with a note that read, "Welcome back, Ringo. We love you." But love didn't erase the sting of betrayal, especially not from the one man whose words had hurt him the most, the one Ringo would never fully forgive. By the early 1970s, the Beatles were no more. The group that had changed music forever had dissolved under the weight of ego, money, and mistrust. Each member went their own way, John exploring his activism and avant-garde music, Paul building wings, George finding spiritual peace, and Ringo, the quiet soul, left trying to rediscover who he was without the band that defined his entire existence. At first, Ringo handled it all with remarkable grace. He wasn't a man who enjoyed conflict. He was, by nature, easygoing, content to let others lead the way. But even he couldn't escape the bitterness that followed the Beatles' breakup. For years, fans and journalists asked the same questions over and over. Who caused the split? Who hated who? And no matter how hard Ringo tried to stay neutral, there was one man he could never quite forgive: Paul McCartney. When the Beatles ended, it wasn't John or George who made the first public move, it was Paul. He announced his solo album before the band had officially agreed to go their separate ways, catching everyone, especially Ringo, off guard. To make matters worse, Paul used that press release to subtly distance himself from the others, hinting that the magic of the Beatles was behind him. Ringo felt betrayed. They had agreed to keep things quiet, to part ways privately. But Paul had gone ahead, making himself look like the victim, and in doing so, painted the others as the problem. Tensions exploded shortly after when Ringo was chosen to deliver a letter to Paul. On behalf of John, George, and their manager, Alan Klein, it was meant to be a polite reminder to delay the release of Paul's solo album so it wouldn't clash with the next Beatles record. But when Ringo arrived at Paul's house, the conversation turned ugly. According to Ringo, Paul went ballistic. He accused Ringo of betrayal, shouting that no one had the right to tell him what to do with his music. Ringo tried to stay calm, but as Paul's anger escalated, he realized that this wasn't just about business. It was personal. Later, Ringo admitted, "That was one of the worst meetings I ever had. I went as a friend, and I left as an enemy." Paul would later apologize, but the damage was done. For the first time, Ringo saw a side of his old bandmate he had never wanted to see: cold, self-centered, and obsessed with control. Meanwhile, the media fed off the feud. Headlines screamed about the Beatles' war, with fans taking sides. Some blamed John for his wild behavior, others blamed Paul for his arrogance. But to Ringo, it didn't matter anymore. He just wanted peace. Yet, everywhere he went, people treated him like a relic of a band that had destroyed itself from within. In his quiet moments, Ringo admitted he missed the camaraderie, even the fights. There was something irreplaceable about those four young men in a cramped studio, chasing perfection together. But the friendship was gone, replaced by lawyers, resentment, and distance. During those years, Ringo struggled personally as well. Despite releasing successful solo albums like Ringo, 1973, and Goodnight Vienna, his private life was unraveling. He drank heavily, partied excessively, and lost himself in the chaos of fame. "I was the happy Beatle," he later said, "but I was miserable inside." Even as time softened some of the bitterness, one wound refused to heal: his resentment toward Paul. Ringo had always admired him, not just as a musician, but as a brother. But Paul's ambition, his need to control, had hurt more than Ringo could admit. Their relationship became distant, polite in interviews, but cold in private. When they occasionally crossed paths in the 70s and 80s, there were smiles for the cameras. But everyone close to them knew the truth. It wasn't until decades later that they began to repair what fame and pride had broken. But even then, Ringo's feelings about those painful years remained complicated. He once said quietly in an interview, "You love someone for so long that you forget what it's like to hate them. But sometimes you don't realize you're still carrying that hate deep down where no one can see it."